If they were native, their names might be remembered in ceremony sung in smoke and fire, but they weren't. And so history buried them. Not because they weren't brave, not because they didn't bleed, but because the lines between right and wrong were too hard to draw. Because survival sometimes meant crossing them. If they had died, we'd call them martyrs, but they didn't. And so we don't know what to call them at all. This is not the version of history written in textbooks. This is the version carved into bone, whispered behind closed doors, and nearly forgotten. You're listening to Last See You Never. This is where we speak quietly about the things history often leaves out and the ones we can't afford to forget. In the early days of this country, when trees outnumbered towns and maps were more dream than fact, the frontier was not a place. It was a condition, a state of permanent risk. Out there, law did not exist. Culture clashed with culture. Gunpowder met flint. Fire answered fire. There were no rules, only reactions. And in the middle of it all were people who never asked to be remembered. A soldier sentenced to be burned, a trapper hunted for sport, a mother who traded grief for revenge. Each one crossed into places we don't like to talk about. But if we want to understand what built the early edges of America, we need to look closely, not at the glory, but at the cost. These are not just stories of survival. They are choices made in moments where no good ones existed. And whether you agree with what they did or not, you should at least hear them out. Because silence, too, is a kind of death. They painted my face black. I had seen it done before, just once, and I never forgot. The man it happened to was led out at dawn the next morning, tied to a post, and burned alive while the village watched in silence. Not out of cruelty, not in madness, but as justice, as ceremony. When the brush touched my skin and the charcoal smeared across my cheeks, I knew that whatever came next would not involve a trial. It would not involve mercy. It would be fire. And yet, I was still breathing. Somehow, the days before that moment had been a blur of violence, rain, and rope. It started with the horses. We saw them from the ridge, sleek, strong, tied loosely at the edge of the Shawnee camp. We didn't come to steal. We came to watch, to count warriors to report back. But we were tired, hungry, reckless. I made the call. We slipped down in the dark, untied what we could, and ran. 12 horses, 3 men, and one angry shout from a warrior who had not been sleeping as deeply as I had hoped. They chased us through the trees. Rain began to fall slow at first, then heavy enough to turn the ground beneath us to liquid. The Ohio River rose fast, angry, swollen, wild. The horses balked at the edge, refused to enter. I told the others to stay back while I climbed the hill to see how far behind they were. I never made it back down. 5 warriors crested the hill opposite me. I raised my rifle, pulled the trigger, and heard the soft, wet click of failure. The powder was soaked. I ran. Not with hope, not with a plan. Just the useless instinct of someone who refuses to die cleanly. They caught me before I made it 50 yards. One grabbed my shoulders while the other swept my legs. I went down hard. By the time I looked up, one of my men was gone. The other lay somewhere I couldn't see. I heard the gunshot. A minute later, they returned with his scalp. The rope around my wrist came next. Then the beatings. Not wild, not savage, but methodical. My face, my ribs, my back. They dragged me for days, tied behind a pony through underbrush and bramble that tore my skin like flint. At night, they stretched my arms and legs so tight I thought my joints would crack. I bit my tongue so I wouldn't scream. One evening, they tied me to a green pony, unbroken and twitching, then slapped it hard to make it run. Branches sliced across my chest like knives. I wanted to close my eyes, but the fear that I'd never open them again kept them wide. By the third day, I could no longer tell whether the pain in my limbs was real or imagined. I stopped thinking about escape, but they didn't want me dead. Not yet. Not here. This was a road to something else, to somewhere else. And then we arrived. Makachek, their central village. I had never seen it, but had heard stories. It was larger than I expected. Built near water, surrounded by forest full of people who stared when I passed, but did not speak. Only the children laughed. One man pulled me forward by the rope and pointed at 2 lines of warriors forming a corridor between them. The Gauntlet. I had heard of it. Prisoners were made to run through while everyone struck them with fists, clubs, whatever they held. If you reached the end, you lived to be judged. If you fell, you might not get up. I ran, or tried to. The first blow landed before my foot hit the dirt. I stumbled. Someone grabbed my hair and yanked me upright. Another hit my stomach. I doubled over, felt a foot under my ribs, and rolled to the side. I think I made it halfway. Then I blacked out. When I woke, they were laughing. Someone handed me water. Not much. Just enough to keep the blood moving. I ran again the next day, and the day after that. My body gave up before my mind did. On the 4th morning, they brought the black paint. I knew what it meant. I had maybe 12 hours, but fate or something stranger had a different plan. They brought me to the council house. I didn't ask why. I couldn't speak even if I wanted to. My jaw was swollen, my mouth dry, my throat cut raw from shouting in dreams. The council room was dark, filled with smoke and faces I didn't recognize. Until I did. A man stood near the back wearing British colors, speaking in the Shawnee tongue with ease. I had seen that face once under the Virginia sun years ago. Simon Gertie. We had been boys together, fought side by side in Lord Dunmore's war. He had taken a different path when the colonies rebelled. Some said traitor, some said spy. The Shawnee called him brother. He didn't recognize me at first. Who would in this state? But when he approached, something shifted in his eyes. He asked my name. I hesitated. If I spoke, I might condemn myself, but not speaking meant death anyway. I told him, and I saw him flinch. Gertie turned to the council, speaking fast, full of fire. He reminded them of raids he had led with their warriors, of maps he had drawn, of blood he had spilled for their cause. He told them if they had ever trusted him, they would let me live. The war club was passed. That was their way. A silent pass meant mercy. 3 knocks on the ground meant death. It moved from hand to hand. A few knocks, more silences, and then it stopped. They would spare me, not out of pity, not even respect, but as a favor to a man they called kin. A woman who had lost her son came forward. She touched my face, then my chest. She said nothing, just placed a hand on my shoulder. In that gesture, I understood. I had been adopted, not as family, but as a ghost to fill a space someone else had left. For 2 weeks, I was left alone, given food, water, rest. Gertie stayed near. We spoke little. There's nothing to say. And then one morning, he said we were leaving. He had secured horses, clothes. He would escort me out. We rode slow, quiet. Across land neither of us would ever call home again. But peace never lasts on the frontier. Not when everyone carries a memory they haven't yet buried. Less than 3 weeks later, we were stopped by another Shawnee band. They said the council's decision had been wrong, that I should have died. They took me back. This time there was no fire in Gertie's words, only silence. He asked for a delay, that the execution wait until a larger gathering at Sandusky. The council agreed, not for my sake, but because they wanted a bigger audience. Spectacle mattered, message mattered. On the road there, I was beaten again, harder this time. One broke my arm with a club, another shattered my collarbone with the edge of a tomahawk. I couldn't raise my head, could barely breathe. They no longer tied me to ponies. I couldn't walk fast enough to run. They stopped fearing me. That was the most dangerous thing of all. But even broken, even stripped of everything I had, I still had one thing left. Time. And someone else had plans for it. Chief Logan, a Mingo leader with more wisdom than pride. He heard of me, heard of my condition. He sent word, not to the Shawnee, but to their allies, the British. He knew what mattered to the council, not mercy, not blood, trade. When we arrived at Sandusky, I saw the stake, the wood stacked high. My face was painted again, but then it rained. A storm rolled in, fast tearing across the sky like judgment. The firewood was soaked. The council called for a delay, and that delay saved my life. The next morning, the British arrived. Traitors, diplomats. They came with guns, rum cloth, and something else. A request. They wanted me. For reasons I still don't know, they offered goods worth $100. The council debated, and then agreed. Not because they believed in forgiveness, but because trade is older than vengeance. I was handed over a commodity with a pulse, taken to Detroit, held, questioned, then finally released. 2 years. That's how long I survived from the moment I stole a horse to the day I rode away free. 2 years of rope rein and names I can still hear in my sleep. I should have died, but I didn't. And I've never stopped wondering what that means. I never spoke of it much after. Not because I was ashamed, not because I was proud, but because the words never seemed to carry the weight of it. People wanted tales of courage, of clear right and wrong, of the brave American soldier and the savage enemy. But it was never that simple. I had seen kindness in the hands that once beat me. I had seen cruelty in the silence of those who watched, and I had learned that survival has a price no one counts until it's too late. What Gertie did for me, he never asked me to repay. What Logan did, he never mentioned again. They were men of different loyalties, different tongues, but they understood something most men never do. That in war, there are debts that cannot be paid in gold or blood, only in memory. I carried that weight with me into every campaign after. I served again, I fought again. But I never looked at my enemy the same way, because I had once been their prisoner. I had once been their brother, and I had once been the ghost of a son they had lost. When I tell this story, and I rarely do, I don't tell it to be remembered. I tell it because somewhere out there, someone is trying to survive something they never chose. They are tied to something they can't escape, and they are looking for proof that endurance is possible, that pain can be walked through, that fire doesn't always win. So here's what I say. If you ever find yourself on the edge of everything you know in the hands of those who see you as nothing more than a name to be erased, remember this. Not all ropes hold forever. Not all councils agree. Not all storms bring destruction. Some bring rain, and sometimes that's enough. Enough to wait, enough to last, enough to see one more sunrise. I did not earn my life that day. I simply refused to let it go. That may not make me a hero, but it made me someone who lived. And sometimes in the world we built from smoke and broken treaties that was all a man could hope for. They say time softens everything, but that's not true. Some things stay sharp. The memory of wet gunpowder, the sound of a gauntlet before the first strike lands, the way your body learns to keep moving even when your mind is begging to stop. I don't remember every mile I walked with a broken arm or how many days passed without sleep. But I remember the coldness of the stairs and the heat of the fire that never lit. I remember the silence right after the war club stopped passing. That breathless moment between death and reprieve. I don't share this to dwell on suffering. I share it because people forget what this land once demanded. Not politics, not slogans, but endurance. Grace even when surrounded by violence. And faith not in salvation, but in the possibility of another step forward. My name may not matter to most, but what I endured belongs to something larger than one life. It belongs to a story that was never supposed to be told. And now you've heard it. They told me to run. Not in anger, not in panic. It was almost casual, like a joke they had shared 1,000 times before. The way a boy might say it to another before a game of chase. But there was no laughter. And I knew they weren't playing. I had no clothes, no shoes, no weapon. Just 100 miles of prairie and the knowledge that behind me were warriors bred for this land with lungs that never quit and legs carved by the hunt. I didn't wait to argue. I ran, not because I thought I could win, but because they wanted to see me fall, and I refused to give them that. I had been a scout, a trapper, a man who walked alone where maps turned to guesswork and stars were the only compass. But I had never been prey. Not like this. Not with the land itself working against me with cacti slicing open the soles of my feet and thorns clinging to my skin like claws. It started just days before. Potts and I had been moving along the Missouri near what is now Montana, checking trap lines set the night before. We paddled slowly, trying not to draw attention. But we were not alone. I heard it first. A low rumble along the ridge above us like hooves or footfalls too many to count. I told Potts we needed to turn back, but he waved me off. Said it was probably bison. I knew better. Within moments they were there. Blackfeet warriors lined the bank's bows, drawn eyes hard. There was no point in running. Not then. We pulled ashore. I spoke a little of their language enough to offer peace to explain our presence, but peace was never the goal. Potts panicked. As they reached for him, he shoved the canoe back, raised his rifle, and fired. He didn't miss, but neither did they. Arrows flew before the smoke from his shot cleared. Potts collapsed into the canoe dead before he hit the wood. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. That restraint, I think, is what saved me. They stripped me, searched me, argued in a tongue I half understood. Then one stepped forward. He pointed to the horizon and said it. Run. I didn't ask how far. I just ran. The grass cut my shins. The sun was sharp and hot above me. I could hear them behind me, voices rising the heavy thud of feet on earth. They gave me a head start, not because they were kind, because they wanted it to be fair, because they wanted a story to tell. I don't know how far I ran before the pain set in. I lost track of time. Every breath was fire, every step a gamble. Blood ran from my feet. My nose began to bleed. I felt something tear in my side, but I didn't stop. When I looked back, they were still there. Most had fallen behind, but one was gaining. A runner, fast, spear in hand. He didn't tire, didn't waver. I could feel him getting closer with every step. 50 yards, 30, 10, and I knew I wouldn't make it to the river. The Jefferson was still a mile off, maybe more, so I stopped, not in surrender, in calculation. I turned, hard, unexpected. He was mid-stride and couldn't adjust. His feet tangled. He stumbled, dropped the spear. I grabbed it, didn't think, just acted. The broken shaft hit his chest. He dropped. I didn't check if he was dead. I just ran. Again. The rest were still behind me, but now I had space and blood on my hands. I pushed forward. My lungs screamed. My legs went numb. But the river came into view, cold, wide, and unforgiving. I didn't hesitate. Dove straight in. The water stung every cut, but it carried me. I found a beaver lodge near the far bank. Dove beneath. Pulled myself inside into a pocket of air, and waited. I could hear them above feet on the wood voices sharp. One jabbed a spear into the lodge too close to my leg, but they never found me. Hours passed. The sun shifted. The voices faded. I stayed until dark, then slipped back into the water, let the current carry me south. When I felt it was safe, I crawled ashore and walked. I was alone, naked, bleeding, but alive. I had no food, no flint, nothing but instinct and desperation. For 11 days, I followed the river drinking when I could, sleeping in fits, avoiding every sign of movement. I ate roots, chewed bark, sucked moisture from leaves. My feet were shredded. My skin cracked. The cold was worse than the hunger. The silence worse than the pain. But I walked, one step, then another, until Fort Raymond came into view. I don't remember the moment I arrived, just the faces that stared, the arms that reached, the voice that said my name like a question. I collapsed before I could answer. They said it was a miracle, that no man could have lived through that. But I knew better. It wasn't a miracle. It was something worse. It was earned, bought with every second I didn't give up. I don't talk about it often, because people don't want the truth. They want legend. They want to believe I was made different, stronger, smarter, but I wasn't. I was just stubborn and lucky, and willing to do what it took. Years later, I learned what started it. The Blackfeet had clashed with Lewis and Clark's men just a few years before. 2 warriors killed. The first time, blood had spilled between them and the Americans. After that, no white man was safe in their lands. We weren't trappers to them. We were a warning. I don't blame them. Not really. We brought maps and deals, but we also brought guns and promises we didn't keep. The frontier wasn't just wilderness. It was grief with no place to go. And that grief found us. When I dream now, it's not the chase I see. It's the moment I stopped running. The choice, the turn, the spear, and the way to win fell silent after. There are things a man never forgets. Not because he wants to hold on, but because the land won't let him forget. I walked away from them that day, but I carried it all with me. Still do, because running can save your life, but it never sets you free. Sometimes I wonder if he would have spared me. The one with the spear. Maybe he was just playing a part expected of him. Maybe he had a brother who died in that fight with Lewis and Clark. Maybe he had no choice. I never saw his face clearly, just the blur of motion and the glint of muscle. But his death bought me time. And time out there is everything. I never learned his name. He became part of my memory, like the river, like the blood on my hands, like the silence afterward. They called me a legend after. Said my run was proof of frontiersman grit, of American spirit. But none of them saw the fear, the humiliation, the way the grass cut into my legs, or how my own heartbeat drowned out my thoughts. No one ever talks about how loud survival is, how much it echoes later when all you want is quiet. I went back to trapping, but never that far west. I stuck to the valleys, the safer paths if there were such things. I met men who had stories like mine but refused to tell them. Some drank them away, some buried them. I tried both. Neither worked. Sometimes sitting by a fire with the stars overhead, I'd hear a noise in the brush and feel that same sharp panic. My muscles would tighten, my breath would stop, and for a moment I was back on that prairie naked, running for my life. I know what I looked like to them, an intruder, a trespasser. I had no flag, no right, just a rifle and ambition. And though I never raised a hand against them, my presence alone was enough. That's what settlers never understand. That sometimes your existence is the offense. That just walking where you're not wanted is enough to spark a war. I don't speak of the boy who died next to me, Potts. He deserved better. He deserved peace. But he died with his rifle in his hand, and that was the only choice he had left. I think of him often, of how quickly it happened. One heartbeat he was there, the next he was gone. The Blackfeet didn't scream when they killed him. They didn't roar. It wasn't hatred, it was precision. A lesson passed from one generation to the next. I respect that. I fear it. But I respect it, because I know what it means to live by code to protect what's yours, and I know what it means to be hunted. If I could go back, would I still step into that canoe? Still trap beaver in their territory? Still think my knowledge of the land made me untouchable? I don't know. Youth is a kind of blindness, and the frontier doesn't forgive blindness. It teaches, brutally, but it teaches. My scars are faded now, my feet healed. The story retold so many times it feels like someone else's. But some nights when the wind comes from the west and the moon is low, I still dream of running, not away from death, but toward the river, toward the cold, toward the chance that maybe, just maybe, I'd get one more day. And that has to be enough. Because out there, when the world gave you nothing but teeth and silence, one more day was the greatest victory you could ever ask for. There's a kind of clarity that only comes after everything is stripped away. No clothes, no tools, no sense of safety. Just you and the land and the knowledge that no one is coming to save you. I think everyone should face that once, even if only in their mind. Not to suffer, but to understand what truly matters. Not pride, not anger, just breath, movement, the next step. The world looks different after you've seen it from the edge, after you felt it trying to swallow you whole. I don't tell this story so anyone remembers me. I tell it because someone else might be out there cold bleeding and hunted. And maybe hearing this will remind them that if one man made it out, they can too. Not clean, not whole, but alive. And that is everything. They burned our town behind us. I remember the smoke curling into the March sky, thick and gray, the way it caught in the bare trees like warning flags. I was still bleeding, not from wounds, but from birth. My 9th child, a girl named Martha, had come just days before. My body ached in places no one could see, and yet I ran, or tried to. My husband Thomas had taken the older children through the back fields toward the river. The nurse Mary Neff stayed by my side. She held Martha when my arms failed. We didn't scream. There was no time. The Abenaki came fast, about 30 of them, though it might as well have been 100. Their feet moved like water over stone. They didn't knock, didn't shout. They entered homes and left silence and fire. By the time we reached the edge of town, we were already surrounded. My husband had a musket. He fired once, then again. I saw him disappear into the woods with 8 of our children, but we, the newborn Mary and I, were left behind. Caught. They didn't speak to us, just tied our hands and pushed us into the trees. My legs barely held. Mary walked close, whispering prayers I couldn't hear. That night they killed my baby. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even a ceremony. Martha cried. Of course she did. She was hungry, cold, afraid. One of them turned wordless and took her from Mary's arms. He swung her once, and the sound her skull made against the tree stays with me even now. Not because it was loud, but because everything else went quiet. Mary fell to her knees. I didn't. I just stared. Because when something breaks in you that deep, your tears retreat. That night I learned that grief can be too big for sound. They didn't bury her. They didn't let us. We walked through snow and wet earth with blood on our skirts and nothing in our arms. I was no longer a mother. I was a body they used to carry weight and gather wood. In their camp, we were not beaten. We were not starved. We were simply ignored, treated like tools, not people. The others, mostly children from the raid, cried in silence. One boy no older than 14 stared at the fire for hours. Later I learned his name was Samuel Leonardson. He had been their captive for 2 years. I never asked what he had seen. I can already guess. Days passed, maybe weeks. The land blurred, frozen and brown. We were taken north, deeper into what they called Pennacook territory, near the river that would someday be known as the Merrimack. They didn't fear escape. We were exhausted, broken, unarmed, and surrounded by a wilderness that held no mercy. At one point, they spoke of a ceremony, of stripping us, forcing us to run their gauntlet, but they never did. Maybe because they saw no fight left in us. Maybe because they thought it would be pointless. They were wrong. I wasn't finished. Not yet. The group that held us was a family. 2 men, 2 women, 6 children, 12 in all. They didn't hate us, but they didn't see us as equals either. I was something between a burden and a symbol. A message that their raid had succeeded. One night when the sky was low and the fire burned quiet, I heard one of the women say that we would be traded, or adopted, or killed. The uncertainty settled in my bones like cold. That's when I began to plan. Not revenge, not yet, just escape. Mary and I whispered at night beneath the animal skins they gave us. Samuel listened. He didn't say much, but I could see the question in his eyes. Could we do it? Would we? We didn't answer him, not at first. But that night I dreamed of my daughter. She wasn't bleeding. She wasn't broken. She was just looking at me, as if to ask what I would do now. And I knew. On the 29th of April, we made our move. The camp slept. 12 bodies under stretched hide and flickering shadows. I had watched where they kept the weapons, had learned their routines. I moved first. Quiet, slow. Samuel followed. Mary held back until the last moment. I took the tomahawk. It felt heavy, too big for my hands, but right. I raised it over the first man's chest. I didn't think. I brought it down. Bone cracked like dry bark. The second man woke but didn't have time to rise. Samuel struck him hard, then again. The women screamed. I didn't stop, neither did he. One woman ran, one child too. I still remember the look in her eyes. Not fear, just betrayal. As if she couldn't believe we had turned into wolves. But we had. We had no choice. 6 of their children died that night. I don't write that proudly. I write it because it happened. Because that was the language the world had taught me. Blood for blood. Silence for silence. When it was done, the fire still burned. I felt it on my face. I felt it in my hands. My arm shook, but I did not fall. We took their canoe. We loaded food, and then, God forgive us, we took the scalps. 10 in all. Not for cruelty, not for ritual, but because the Massachusetts Bay Colony had promised 50 pounds for each one. And I had nothing left. No land, no family. Just a rage that needed something to show for itself. We paddled south against current and fear. For days. No one followed. Maybe they didn't believe we could do it. Maybe they didn't care. When we reached Haverhill, the town didn't cheer. It stared. Some called us monsters, others heroes. I said nothing. Just handed over what we had and waited for someone to tell me I was still alive. The government gave us the reward. 50 pounds to share, 25 for me, 12 and 10 shillings for Mary, the same for Samuel. Enough to live on, not enough to forget. I never spoke much after that. Not of the baby, not of the night, not of what it feels like to raise your hand over someone smaller than your grief. I lived into my 80s. People called me a folk hero, built statues, painted scenes, but none of them showed the blood under my nails or the shaking in my knees. None of them asked whether I regretted it. Maybe because they were afraid of the answer. Maybe because they already knew. The frontier was not a place. It was a condition. One of uncertainty, hunger, and violence passed down like a name. I did not become a killer. I became someone the world made when it refused to offer any other shape. When people speak of survival, they imagine strength, muscles, fire. But survival is often quiet. It looks like submission. Sounds like silence, feels like guilt. I carried mine in a space between my ribs, where her cry used to be. When I sleep now, I still hear it. Not the scream, but a moment just before, when I thought I might save her, when I still believed in something soft. That part of me is gone, and maybe that's what they wanted all along. Not our land, not our homes, but our softness. Our faith, our ability to believe that things might ever be simple again. But I remember, and I tell this not because I want you to see me as brave. I tell it because there are still places in this world where women walk with fire in their bellies and axes in their hands. Not because they want to, but because no one else is coming. And because sometimes justice waits too long, and then becomes something else entirely. After it was over, people asked why I took the scalps, why I didn't just run, why I didn't leave quietly and let the night bury itself. They asked with curious eyes and tilted heads as if they couldn't imagine rage becoming a map. As if they hadn't seen their own towns offer money for proof that a death had occurred. I did what I had to do. Not because I was angry, though I was. Not because I hated them, though I might have. I did it because that was the language of the frontier. You did not speak unless you could show the weight of your voice. And in that world, nothing spoke louder than what you carried back. I sometimes hear people say I was the first American woman honored with a statue. That I stood for courage, for resistance, for some kind of proto-patriotism. But I never asked for that. I didn't kill for country. I didn't escape to prove a point. I moved because standing still meant becoming a footnote in someone else's fire. Mary never said much after either. We shared glances when the questions came. Samuel grew older and quieter, became a man in a world that barely remembered his boyhood. But I never forgot what he looked like that night. Not afraid, not trembling, but resolved. He struck when he needed to, and in doing so saved me. Or perhaps we saved each other. We did not talk about the dead children, not to others, not even to ourselves. Because there are some truths too hard to fold into polite company. Some acts that sit outside even the harsh logic of war. I never believed myself clean. Never wore the title of hero without flinching. But I did wear it because no one else would carry the burden for me. The men in Boston who paid for the scalps never saw the faces behind them. They never asked who the children were, or why they were there, or what would become of the woman who raised her hand and didn't stop. They handed over the coins, nodded at the paperwork, and moved on. That was their privilege. That was my sentence. I lived a long life. Longer than many of the women I knew. I remarried, I gardened, I buried more children, though not by fire. I sat on porches and watched generations grow into a world that forgot how the land beneath them had been bought. Not just with money, but with flesh. I want you to know this, not so you remember me, but so you understand the cost of stories like mine. When you hear the frontier, you may hear of pioneers of open land of promise, but you should also hear this. Hear the silence of snow before it's stained. Hear the weight of an axe before it drops. Hear the breath the mother takes when she knows no help is coming. That is the sound of survival. That is the shape it takes. It is not glorious. It is not noble. It is necessary. I never found peace, but I found something that lived beside it. A kind of knowing that when the world collapses, it will not be the strongest who rise first. It will be the ones who remember how to carry grief without letting it spill. It will be the ones who walk through fire not because they are fearless, but because they have nothing left to burn. And if that is who you are, then take this story. Carry it. Change it if you must. But do not forget it. Because what we survive becomes what we teach. And what we teach becomes who we are. They lived, and for that they were feared, forgotten, and misunderstood. Kenton, who saw mercy in the unlikeliest hands. Coulter, who ran through death and came out breathing. Dustin, who took back the night that tried to consume her. These were not perfect people. They were not saints or symbols. They were men and women flung into moments no one would choose. And they responded not with glory, but with instinct, grit, and pain that followed them longer than most will ever know. We don't tell their stories to justify them. We tell them because in each one there is something that reflects the shape of survival. Something that defies the easy lines between hero and monster. Something that demands we look closer and listen longer. The frontier was not just wilderness, it was a mirror. It showed people who they were when everything else had been stripped away. And what it revealed was never easy, but it was always real. These are the kinds of stories we keep hidden because they are complicated, because they force us to admit that strength often comes wrapped in sorrow and that justice, when delayed too long, becomes vengeance. But without them, we don't understand who we were, and we certainly can't understand who we've become. If stories like these matter to you, let us keep telling them. You know what to do, not for likes, not for shares, but because the past is heavy, and someone has to carry it. Someone has to remember, because if we don't, the silence will, and silence forgets everything. So we speak, not to glorify, not to forgive, but to hold the fire a little longer, to walk a little further, to listen to what was never meant to be erased. After all, the past isn't dead. It's not even past.